Okay, we're going to now go to Heather Mason. She's from Canada. She's a former federal prisoner and founding member of CaWsbar, which is Canadian Women's Sex-Based Rights. And she's going to talk to us about the history of women's corrections and the difference between men and women's prisons. Thank you so much for being here. Over to you, Heather.
Hi, thanks for having me. As you know, my name's Heather, and I was incarcerated in jails and the women's prison in Ontario. So the first time I was incarcerated was 2014. I had a drug problem, and it kept leading me back to jail. And this is it's common. That's what a lot of women in Canada are actually in jail for. So women are the fastest growing prison population in Canada and worldwide. And a lot of the factors that result in the incarceration of women is violence against women, poverty, drug addiction resulting from trying to numb ourselves from our sexual and physical abuse in our childhood and throughout our young adult life. So most of us numb ourselves with drugs. And then a lot of us end up in prostitution, actually, to be able to afford to buy our drugs. I find that most of us women turn to selling our bodies to make money for our drugs, whereas men are out committing more violent crimes. So the way that women end up going to jail is a lot different. Many have been traumatized. It's about 80% of women that are incarcerated in our federal prisons that are in prison for navigating crimes relating to poverty and abuse. And a lot of these women that are even in for so-called violent crimes are typically acting in self-defense or in defense of their children. A lot of them plead guilty because they don't want to deal with the trial and how long it takes to actually proceed through the legal system. And most of these women that are convicted of the so-called violent crime, they're actually, and if they serve life sentences, they actually score lower on the risk assessment tool that Correctional Services of Canada uses compared to women that are convicted of lesser crimes, which is actually pretty interesting. So I wanted to give a little bit of a background on women's corrections. I feel like people aren't aware that men's corrections and women's corrections are different. So up until essentially 30 years ago, women's corrections resembled men's. There wasn't a whole lot of difference. So the first women's federal prison, so in Canada, we have provincial jails and we have federal prisons, and our federal prisons are for 2 years plus a day. So in 1934, they actually opened a prison for women in Kingston, Ontario. And within years of it opening, the first commission called for its closure. Over the course of them being open, they had no less than 15 inquiries or reports calling for the closing of prison for women. A lot of the criticism that was included in these reports was like the lack of specific programming for women, geographical dislocation, since Canada's so big and there was only one prison in Ontario, separation from women and their families and their communities, inappropriate classifications, and we're still dealing with this one, overrepresentation of Indigenous women. They top 42% of our prison population. So they found that women did not do well in environments that are built for men. Go figure. In 1989, they actually created a task force for federally sentenced women. And then in 1990, they released the report called Creating Choices. So you can look up the Creating Choices report, and this is the foundation of how women's corrections was built. And the task force was co-chaired by Correctional Services of Canada and the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies, which is actually supposed to be Canada's only national organization that advocates for federally sentenced women, and they have turned their backs on us. They are mute. They have no comment regarding this matter. They don't want to speak on it. So yeah, they are the ones that help build women's corrections, and now they are responsible for dismantling women's corrections. So between 1989 and 1992, 7 women committed suicide in prison for women because they could not handle the horrific living conditions. 6 of those 7 women were actually Indigenous women. So that really got things moving when all those women committed suicide. And actually, they're still fighting for a memorial garden in Kingston right now for those women who took their lives to make prisons better for us. Prisons are not good for us, but they gave their lives to make it better living conditions for us. And the women can't even get a memorial garden to remember that. That's crazy. 1994, there was what we call the P4W incident, which is actually a strip search incident. So in 1994, there was a lot of hostile fighting with the guards, and the women started rioting over racist comments and the way that they were being treated. And 4 days after the riot started, that all was calmed down. The women were in their cells sleeping. Well, the warden made a call to have the men's site deployed to the women's site. So that means taking guards that are trained in like tactical response that work with men, and they had them come into the women's prison. And then they went into the women's cells, they pulled them out of bed, and they cut their clothes off of them while they were holding them down on the floor, and they strip searched them. There's video footage of it, very small clip. They tried to hide that. And then they put them in these little house coats and like paper house coats and slippers, and put them in the back of the transport bus, which is actually, you stand in cages that are locked. And then they brought them over to Kingston Penitentiary, which is a men's prison. And in the video, you can hear the men screaming like swear words and all sorts of things while the women were getting out of the bus. And you could see how scared they were. And they put them in segregation in Kingston Penitentiary, and they were there for a few months. They had to launch a habeas corpus to get themselves taken out of segregation. It was actually one of my really good friends that was involved with that riot, and that was brought to Kingston Penitentiary. And she said that they were stuck in segregation with like a bunch of sex offenders, like rapists and diddlers, like screaming at them all the time. And they said they were so scared. And then in 1996 was like the actual commission of the events that led up to that strip search. So all of this happened. There was a lot of research, there was a lot of interviews, and the Creating Choice report became the cornerstone on which CSC built the 6 regional prisons. And this report is their justification for the significant differences between men's and women's prisons. So currently, Correctional Services of Canada is really big on telling everyone that they're not just transferring a male who identifies as a woman to any given security facility, but they're lying, okay? So yes, men and women's prisons have minimum, medium, and maximum security classification, but they're different. It's the same name classification, but women do not have maximum security measures or risk. So what they've done is they've taken the risk assessment tool that was designed for white men, and they've taken it and they've applied it to women. Well, the problem that they had was that the women weren't fitting across all 3 levels of security because they don't have that risk. So what they did is they downsized so they made it smaller so that they could apply it to women, and that way they could fit across the 3 security levels. So when you have maximum transfers from men's prison transferring to women's prisons, you are in fact transferring them to a lower security facility because they do not have the security measures. So CSC blatantly lies about this, and this can all be proved in all the court documents. So if you go on and you look at court documents where they've fought prior transfers, they talk about the security risk. They talk about the differences between the structure and protocols for women's and men's prisons. So there's less security, which includes perimeter fences, house-style accommodations. We have no firearms. Also, they're not allowed to use violence as a first approach. They have to talk. We have the mother-child programming. We also have policies that prevent male staff from doing all that female staff can do. They also have gender or cross-monitoring gender training. I probably screwed up the way that said, but men have to demonstrate an ability to be able to work in women's prisons. They can't just go and work there. So we know, and CSC knows, and everyone else knows the differences between women's and men's corrections. It's not rocket science, right? So what is happening is there's transfers that are coming. For an example would be Quebec. So Jamie had applied for a transfer and was denied because of the security risk. So Jamie, and I always screw up the last name, it's like Boulachance, it's French. He evaded police for 13 years, made 2 major escape attempts from men's prisons, and he was held in maximum, more like supermax. So Jamie is one of 7 prisoners in the province that required armed guards as escorts. So obviously denied the transfer. So then Jamie got surgery, which means now CSC can't prevent the transfer. Jamie's transferred from essentially supermax security risk and measures to a medium security facility. So the guards have been protesting about work conditions and safety concerns and measures outside of the women's prison in Quebec, as well as Jamie's lawyer was interviewed saying, well, Jamie's a woman. There's no reason Jamie can't be in a women's prison. They're just going to have to increase security measures. Well, part of women's corrections is to have women in the least restrictive environment possible and to be trauma informed. That's how women's corrections are supposed to be. That's how they were justified with building them the way that they were built. So now what they're doing is they're going, okay, yeah, I can understand there's risk here. We just need to increase the security. So what is happening is women must now accommodate these transfers, and we have to resort back to men's corrections because they are a risk to, one, public. Jamie is 110% a risk to public safety and a risk to women. So now women have to give up what they have, and we have to go back to an environment built for men, which is absolutely ridiculous with the fact that 7 women committed suicide, and that was the pushing point for you to build women's corrections. Another thing with all of this that's going on as well is that we're open, right? So we live in houses, we don't have cameras in our houses, the guards come through once every 2 hours. The guards aren't watching us, right? So they're being transferred in, they're on the medium compound with us, they live in the house with us, we share a bathroom, we share a kitchen, we share a laundry room. They're in there with us. It's like a gated community that's locked and you can't get out, right? And And so we're seeing a lot of maximum security prisoners that want to transfer. And with CSC's policy, it is based on gender identity or self-expression. Anyone can apply for a transfer, and it's up to the Deputy Commissioner for Women to approve or deny the transfer. And they've now created a gender consideration review board, but they're not required to use it. So that board is only there if the Deputy Commissioner can't make a decision and needs to ask for help. So with their new policy as well, which is not up, I have the copy of the new policy. They were taking consultations on it until November, so they should be fixing it and putting it up within this year. The same transfer requirements are the same regardless if you're male or female, but we all know that the criteria is different, right? They will not transfer trans men. We have 12 trans men in our federal prison system right now with us. So essentially our women's prisons are actually co-ed. So we have women, we have trans men, we have trans women, we have men. It's just like one big free-for-all. Men's prisons are still the same. Nothing has been done, which is really crazy to me to think about, because 2/3 of our prisoners with gender considerations, and I say gender considerations because they're not all trans women, and that's what people don't get. They don't have to be trans women. They only have to express themselves as it if they want or not, right? It's gender identity or expression. So it's when they're even transferred, they don't even need to be wearing women's clothing or act like a woman. They can have a beard, they can walk around with their dick out, they can do whatever they want. So 2/3 of those prisoners are still in men's prisons, and a lot of them want to stay. A lot of them are homosexual. Why would they ever want to be with women? So what we've done here is we're saying CSC took the shortcut and was like, okay, we're not discriminating. We are helping people with gender identity, da 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 da, but they are. They've wiped their hands so that they don't have to deal with the situation, right? So all those prisoners, so gay, bisexual, gender nonconforming, trans women, all of them who are at risk, because gay and bisexual men are at just as much risk as well in men's prisons, are still in men's prisons. They're still being discriminated against. They're not getting women's clothing. They're not getting makeup or those other things that they're requesting. So what have we done here? We're downloading 100% of the risk from men's, like violence from men's prisons onto women. We haven't helped 2/3. They're still at risk. Are we just going to ignore them? We're just not going to pay attention to them there. And they're discriminating against trans men because there have been requests and they've denied them for overriding health and safety concerns. So they're plopping in a group in with women and then forgetting about them, not taking care of their needs, not taking care of anything. And we still haven't solved any of the problems. So I feel like they should be looking at, and it's possible, men's prisons are big and there's a lot of them. They do have, men have like living units with wings and pods. So there are prisons where they could take a wing or a living unit from the men's institutions and they can make it an LGBTQ wing. Well, not the L, but make it the wing. And they're not 100% segregated from the prison. They'll still be able to go to gym and programs and stuff with the rest of the institution, but they'll have their needs taken care of. They'll have their programs, they'll have access to any clothing, makeup, etc. that they want, and then we're not putting women at risk. Adam is actually Canada's youngest dangerous offender, and then is in Fraser Valley for women right now. So Adam was the one that got the gender reassignment or sex reassignment surgery and the double D breast implants paid for by taxpayers. and is in Fraser Valley. So he was the one that molested or raped a 3-month-old baby, and the baby had so much damage that it had to have reconstructive surgery. And also confessed to killing a child when he was younger as well. So I'm actually hearing a lot of reports coming out of there because Adam is not happy that he had to have surgery and that the rest of the men that are in there still have their penis. So there's actually been a lot of interesting things coming out of Fraser Valley because currently they have about 5 last I counted. Fraser Valley only has 92 people in it. So the trans population at that women's prison is actually 5.4%. That's what people don't understand. There's only 693 women incarcerated federally across Canada. So when you have such a small portion and when you have a population that's only 92 women, you start putting them in women's prisons, and that really, really changes the dynamic very, very quickly because they're small. Also, there's another question in here, and I feel like it's the org, honestly. I feel like Morgan's here. They're going off about trans women that were in women's prisons being transferred back to men's prisons. CSC only admits to transferring 12, and I can tell you where all 12 of those are. There's actually more because they're not counting the ones that have had surgery. CSC does not transfer men who have had surgery back to men's institutions. And the ones that they've admitted to transferring, there's only one that transferred back to men's prisons, and that was actually Michael Williams, who raped and murdered a 13-year-old Indigenous woman and had issues at Fraser Valley, and the women had issues with him. And he actually got jumped in maximum security by a bunch of Indigenous women who were abused as children because of the way that he was being in the prison, the things that he was saying, and just obviously the presence too when you're confined in those places. So he actually voluntarily transferred back to Kent prison for women, or for men, sorry. And he actually beat up another trans prisoner at Kent and was shipped to Saskatchewan Pen. So I don't know who these other trans people are. I guess Correctional Services of Canada is lying about how many they're transferring. That's the only conclusion I can come to there.